to the pubs. Well, welcome everyone. Great to see you. I think the numbers are stabilizing, so we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm here with Ciro Pirone, who is our presenter of today's webinar, which is entitled Etna, the Amazing Mountain. So we're really looking forward to that. Just quickly, I'll just tell you that next week's webinar is going to be on the delicious wines of Madeira, and it's Simon Wolf who's going to be presenting that. So jot that down on your calendar and join us for that as well. Let me tell you a little bit about Ciro. So he's the director of Italian wines for Horizon Beverage Company. He's a graduate of the Istituto Albagiro, the Hotel and Restaurant Management School of Salerno, Italy. And he's an Italian wine ambassador from the Vineyards Italy Wine Academy. He's so traveling and working in Italy, England, and the US, Ciro developed an incredible passion for wine, food, and culture, probably like all of us here present today. And after growing up in Italy, wine was always a very important part of his family's lifestyle and traditions. In 1999, he moved to the US permanently. He landed in Boston, where he continued his wine studies at Boston University, the International Sommelier Guild, the London-based Wine and Spirits Educational Trust, excuse me, as well as he completed and passed with honors the Italian Wine Specialist certification by the North American Sommelier Association. In June of 2017, and 2019 and 2021 with honors, he completed the Vineyards Italy Wine Academy and received the prestigious Italian Wine Ambassador certification. He also passed with honors in 2019 the Italian Wine Scholar Program, our very own Italian Wine Scholar Program. So we're in very good hands today with Ciro. He's happy to share his passion for Italian wines and culture with wine consumers so that we all have a better understanding and appreciation for Italian wine. So I'm going to pass it over to Ciro. As usual, if you have any questions, click on the Q&A. The Q&A box will pop up. Type your questions in the Q&A box. And I'll come back towards the end and help Ciro moderate the questions. Okay, everyone enjoy the trip to Etna.
Thank you, Mary, for the introduction. And hello, everybody. Though I cannot see you face to face, I only see myself. I actually be sharing the presentation in a quick second, but welcome everybody. It's great to be in between so many passionate wine folks from all over the world, I guess. And most importantly, today we'll be talking about Etna, which is a very, very fascinating subject, something that really has been growing incredibly in the last 15 years. Although, as we'll see, Etna, it's a much, much longer story than that. But yes, over the last 15 years, nobody can get enough of it, and there might as well be, publications on such as Wine Spectator, New York Times, and just Decanter magazine all over the world. And it's a really hot subject as the place itself, right? So as we go through, I try to convey at 360 degrees what Etna is, from the geology of how the volcano formed and how volcanoes are relevant in a country like Italy, and especially southern Italy. And then from there, get into the Etna, specifically the major grapes, styles of wines, whatever, as much as we can cover within the 50 minutes that we have together today. So without further ado, the first thing I want to say, by putting this image here, Etna is called in Sicily by Sicilian as La Montagna. So they don't really refer to it as il vulcano or the volcano, as obviously we know, but they refer as La Montagna because ultimately Etna, it's a very tall mountain that reaches almost 3,300 meters in elevation, so roughly 10,000 feet. And the word itself, montagna, obviously, showcases the message that it's a very, massive, piece of land. And the name itself comes from two words, mon and Mongibello, which basically means both in Latin and in Arab, which obviously was a very big, colonizing force for a few centuries in Sicily. That both words mean mountain in different languages, just to say about the importance and the relevance and the massive sheer size of the mountain itself. But Italy in general, as we all know, it is a country of many volcanoes. Obviously, some volcanoes, especially the ones in the north, they are extinct volcanoes, especially when we think about the Alto Adige section. As you move more towards the central part, here you find still extinct volcano, but they're more recent as far as when they geologically formed. And in the southern part of Italy, which is the area we're zoning in today, and specifically on Etna, this is the area where we find the active volcanoes, which there are several, right? So now a volcano in general in the world, in order to be considered active, has to have basically an eruptive activity within 1 million years. As a matter of fact, even the island of Pantelleria, which really hasn't had any activity since 1391, last time it was recorded, is still considered an active volcano. So that really tells you about how important and how a full throttle, volcanic activity and volcanically formed soils are relevant for the wines of southern Italy. And as a result of the many volcanic eruptions and the activity that happens in southern Italy, as a matter of fact, throughout the years, we've had many earthquakes, right? Italy, it's very earthquake prone, together with also other countries like Greece and Spain specifically. And these are some of the major disasters, if you will, that were caused by earthquakes, starting in Ripening in 1980, which is nearby where I come from. I'm from Salerno. I still remember very vividly, although it's about from me, but I remember shaking, and I was 4 years old, so something I will never forget. Obviously, other than that, there were other very disastrous, like earthquakes that took place, like L'Aquila in 2009, in Emilia 2012, and in central Italy, between basically Abruzzo, Marche, and Umbria area in 2016, so more recently. So that really shows the fact that Italy, and especially central southern Italy, it's always in movement, and that really causes this major earthquake and destruction. But specifically when it comes to Etna, this is one of the volcanoes. This is part of the so-called volcanoes that activated during the Quaternary era. So this is an era that practically started in about 2.5 million years ago until today. And together with Etna, which is the one on mainland Sicily, there are other obviously volcanoes around Sicily, such as the ones from the Aeolian Islands or the Lipari Islands, the famous islands like Vulcano, Stromboli, and others, tiny islands are all basically volcanic rocks. And then the other one also being Pantelleria, which we just mentioned about. But how, interestingly enough, it's always, I think to me, it's always an interesting subject. How do volcanoes form? Practically, as you know, there is, tectonic plates movement keeps pushing the African plate towards the Eurasian plate, and that's how also the Alps form. And when there are two plates meeting each other, eventually a subduction zone is created, as you can see on the image on the left. And practically the softer of the two plate is the one that eventually goes into the mantle. And as it goes into the mantle, eventually starts melting. And all this melting that takes place eventually gets released, if you will, in the form of eruptions. And these eruptions, obviously will release lava, will release all sorts of pyroclastic materials, will form obviously the mountains or the volcanoes that can be underwater as well as can be above water. And eventually that also creates, when there is this very strong friction between the two plates, eventually also causes a tsunami or can cause like very major earthquakes, as we mentioned. And in Italy specifically, this continuous push of the African plate towards the north, kind of like northeast, if you will, and it's kind of pushing Italy to kind of kick backwards a little bit, almost like connecting towards Greece and Albania, which are on the opposite side of the Adriatic Sea, right? As a matter of fact, in that little area, as you can see where it says Old Ocean Crust, there is still a small section of an ancient sea called the Tethys Sea. And basically this ancient sea is being continually subducted under Calabria and Greece, and eventually it will be disappearing altogether. I just put a little information there that tells you basically that the African plate, it's moving at a speed of 8 millimeters per year. So practically that tells us, according to studies done by, like geologists, volcanologists and whatnot, that in 22 million years, although we're not going to be here, Africa and Sicily will be again reconnected as they were once upon a time, right? Now, this is a topographic map of Italy that kind of shows you what volcanologists refer to as the Calabrian Arc. The Calabrian Arc is basically this arch, if you will, along which we find all the major volcanoes of southern Italy. This is kind of maybe a better picture. As a matter of fact, part of the Calabrian Arc, it's also the famous Vesuvio, and even more famous, or probably more scary, more than famous, Campi Flegrei, the Phlegraean fields of Campania as well. Also the Vulture, although Vulture, it is an extinct volcano. And ultimately, all the volcanoes that we find in Sicily, such as, the Etna we see right here, again, the Lipari or Aeolian Islands, which are tiny islands right north of Sicily, and also Pantelleria in the south. And not to forget, there's also a lot of underwater volcanoes, right? So now we're going to get into Etna specifically. So Etna, again, as we mentioned, is part of these youngest born volcanoes, which have only been around for less than 2 million years old. And it also is one of the most active, definitely the most active in Europe, but one of the most active in the world. As a matter of fact, just recently, there were some new eruptions, and the beautiful, gently rolling down lava flows, although scary, but at the same time, people that live in the area, they've lived along the lava flow and the La Montagna for many, 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 thousands of years. And interesting enough, because again, as I mentioned, the Etna is over 3,300 meters of elevation. And as they were studying the volcano, they realized there's over 300 craters. All these craters were formed by practically every crater tells you about a volcanic explosion that formed a new crater and eventually created this massive opening that is on top of the volcano itself. Now, the first civilization that really settled in the area were the Greeks. Obviously, the Greeks were a big, big influence throughout southern Italy. They colonized many and developed many of the, city-states or small towns at the time, especially along the coastlines. And specifically, they came on Etna because of the fertility they discovered in the soils. Obviously, these are soils that are very mineral-rich, so very fertile, very ancient lava flows. Eventually, they've eroded and formed this, different landscape that really it's ideal for growing a lot of different, not only grapes, also all sorts of vegetables throughout the history, right? And when it comes to production, viticulture here goes back many centuries, so it's not a new thing. Although, because the area is fairly rural, you're on top of a high elevation mountain, was never massive production until a certain moment when phylloxera struck basically Europe, and everybody was scrambling, especially when you think about countries like Spain, France, that were first hit, and eventually, obviously, northern Italy and whatnot. And, everybody was scrambling to find grapes. And Etna was one of those territories that really lived through a rebirth, because people were looking for grapes. There was availability up here. Etna is also, because the soils are mostly formed because of actually a variety of reasons. One being elevation, the soils are volcanic, most importantly with a high content of sand. So phylloxera cannot survive in this kind of environment. So Etna became one of these very important territories to provide grapes and also wine for the rest of Europe for an extended period of time. As things got back to normal, the demand for Etna wines kind of like went down again, and it hasn't been until the last 15 to 20 years where, again, so much more interest has been shown. The quality of the wines has become very, very high, with a lot of influence from also not only local people, but also people from other parts of Italy and other parts of the world investing on Etna. And then there's a variety of factors that are important to understand when you think about how different the wines from the volcano are going to be. Some climatic factors, such as the rain. Rain is a very important factor, obviously, depending on what part of the Etna, if we're talking about north, east, or south slopes. Also, this is one of the latest harvested vineyards not only in Sicily, but in general in Italy, just because, again, the elevation conditions tend to be very cool. And it's a very unique situation where we are, yes, in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea on an island, but really the territory is considered to be an alpine territory, an alpine environment because of this extreme high elevation. And then the other critical important element ultimately to the production of wine and the quality of wines is the exposures and the moment of ripening of the grapes. Based on where the vineyards are located, there can be early exposure or early harvest time, moderate exposure and harvest time, and ultimately late exposures and harvest time. Okay. So this actually is a map I put here just to show, again, this as a map actually tells you about the various lava flows that have taken place over many centuries, some very, very ancient, most importantly in the north and in the east. It's where we find the oldest lava flows, which are actually have defined the specific territory to be the most important for the quality of wines, versus in the south, there've been the more current lava flows. As a matter of fact, it's a news of, fairly recent news tells us that the southern, part of the crater is actually the one growing, because as more lava flows continue to erupt from the volcano, obviously also the height of the volcano increases, so which is quite interesting. And the lava flows typically in Sicilian, they're called on the Etna called share. As a matter of fact, you're going to notice when you look at some of the Etna wines, they might be named as a shara 1614. So it practically tells you that that specific wine, it's made from grapes or vines that are located in that specific area where the lava flow occurred in 1614 or whatever the specific year might be. So, but that's kind of like and as you can see, basically the appellation boundaries of the Etna Dock are almost like a backward sea that wraps around the north, eastern, and southern part of the volcano. There's no vineyards on the west, because the western part is also one of the parts where the most lava flows occur. So unfortunately, there's no no activities when it comes to winemaking on that section specifically, right? So now let's talk about Etna Dock, what it is from the inception until today when it comes to the actual area of production. So Etna Dock, it's practically the geographical boundaries of the territory where grapes can be grown and wines can be named after. It first was defined in 1968, but then eventually updated in 2011. What happened in 2011? There was, most importantly, the addition of certain style of wines that weren't allowed the first time around. For example, we think about, as you can see on the bottom, the spumante, rosato, Rosato Superiore, Etna Reserva, those were not, in play originally when Etna Dock was first created, but there was just a Bianco, Bianco Superiore, and Rosso versions, if you will, more on the basic level. And eventually they realized that by understanding and studying better the territory, they realized there was a lot more that could be done rather than just more on the basic level type of wines. Etna, we'll see in a different slide, it's basically that backward sea. It's composed of a territory that comprises 20 different villages, and there are 133 contrade. So contrade, it's kind of like the similar idea what you find in Barolo and Barbaresco, the MGA. But obviously these are like almost like a neighborhoods. The territories might be bigger as far as compared to some of the Barolo and Barbaresco MGAs or single vineyard concept, but the idea is the same, and it's actually Etna is the only other territory of Italy outside of Barbaresco, Barolo, and some of the northern Piemontese appellation where you find the definition of the single vineyard sites. Also, one of the very unique situation that happened to be on Etna is the fact that there's a lot of very old ungrafted vines. As I mentioned, Etna wasn't affected by phylloxera, so there's still a lot of these vines that are well above 100 years of age. So obviously that means great quality, great purity of fruit, and concentration levels not to be found in other parts of Italy or the world in general. And then, as we mentioned, because the fact that this is a mountain of extreme elevation and some of the vineyards reach also 1,100 meters and whatnot, so we have this kind of alpine condition, lots of sunlight, but extreme cool nights, which is kind of something that reminds you also of a lot of the northern Italian, territories. The vineyards really, they start around 300 meters and go all the way to 1100, although the majority of vineyard sites and production really happens between 400 meters and about 800, 850. Then above that, it's minor, and obviously it's more focused on white grapes rather than red grapes, right? Also because especially on the lower part, there's a lot more building of actually towns, buildings and whatnot, where people are living. So a lot of the territory is being taken over by urban developments, if you will. And when it comes to soils, obviously it's a mixture of different things, because where the new lava flows have occurred, obviously there you can't really plant vines, you can't really work, but eventually over the years, decades and whatnot, there is erosion that takes place, and so you're going to have now the possibility to actually plant vines and eventually grow grapes. But anyway, as far as soils, mostly lava, ash, lapilli, pumice, which are also the result of the pyroclastic explosions that take place together with lava flows. The different wines that can be produced, they go on. As far as the whites are concerned, there is a Bianco, which is the more generic version that only requires 60% Caricante, the main white grape of Etna, and the remaining 40% can be, basically a blend of different grapes. The main partner is the Catarratto, which is the more generic grape, especially used on the western part of the island, but also there can be another 15% of other grapes, such as Minella being one of them, which are local grapes, although very, very minor used these days. Then Bianco Superiore instead is the one that requires at least 80% Caricante, although in many cases these wines are 100% Caricante, and it's grown in one specific area of one and only specific area of the Etna on the eastern side, which we'll see in the next slide. Then Rosso instead, again, it's practically the base wine produced on Etna when it comes to red wines, which is a minimum 80% Nerello Mascalese, and then the remaining being Nerello Cappuccio for the most part, although there's also possibility to add other local grapes, right? And then these newer versions that came into play in 2011, so there's also Spumante version, Rosato that comes into season, and then there's a Rosato also made in a Spumante version. And last but not least, in some cases, especially in great vintages, producers can make an Etna Rosso Reserva, which has a minimum requirement of 4 years, at least 1 year in wood. And also I put the yields per hectare, so it kind of gives you an idea how seriously, first of all, here the yield per hectare sometimes reaches up to 10,000 vines, which means a lot of vine potentially in a very small piece of land, but the yield at the same time, it's very low when you compare to other parts of Italy, other wines of Italy. Here we're only about 9 tons per, not about, but we're 9 tons per hectare. For the Reserva, it's 8 tons. So that tells you also how seriously you take the wine. And it's important to showcase the quality of the product. So here's a map that shows you as I mentioned, this backward see the 20 townships that are part of the Etna DOC denomination. And also I listed on the left just few of the contrade. Obviously there's 133. Some are just like in Barolo, which they have 181 altogether. Some are very important, very historical, extreme high quality. Some are almost like irrelevant. So as they say, caveat emptor, meaning that you want to know, sometimes everybody's trying to jump on the bandwagon of having a contrada name on the label, just because people are willing to pay more money for the single vineyard concept. But in some cases, it doesn't really have the meaning they should have, maybe because the contrada is not as high as far as the quality of the environment or the soil. So it's not going to be a greater wine just because that's the name of a contrada. But anyway, some to definitely know and to look after are Guardiola, Feudo di Mezzo, Rampante, definitely Passo Bisciaro. And also I listed Caselle. Caselle is the specific one, probably considered to be the Grand Cru for contrade, for the production of the white wine, so the Caricante for the Etna Bianco Superiore. And these contrade, interestingly enough, are defined by a variety of factors, one being geological, basically in the fact that the contrade's boundaries are defined by when or where the lava flow occurred. So practically the lava flow flew in a specific way, and that is exactly the geographical boundary of that contrada. Also the altitude, which is very, very important factor on Etna, as we know, because we are in extreme environment. Soil depth, also very critical. And lastly, social meaning that in some cases, in a certain contrade, which is again, this almost like a little neighborhood within the township, a certain activity was taking place. For example, there is a contrada known as Porcaria. In Porcaria, specifically, they would raise hogs, so kind of porco in Italian or in slang, it means pig. So it's kind of like the activity that would take place there for a long period of time, right? So this is just a picture that shows you practically the some of the old vines on Etna, which are all planted, or for the most part planted on Alberello etneo, and also the dark, very, very dark soil composition, because of lots of obviously sand, lots of volcanic lava and whatnot. And now talk about the three really main grapes, which are part of the Etna wines, right? First and foremost would be Caricante. Anytime we talk about why Etna, Caricante is the key grape. You got to figure that there was a time, we're talking about the end of the 1800s, when on Etna there was over 50,000 hectares dedicated to vines. As of today, it's only like 2000, so very, very small compared to what it was. And I'm talking about in general between white and red grapes. If you think about Caricante specifically, we're talking about only 50 hectares. So production is very, very small, almost like irrelevant to a certain degree. But again, the wines are extremely high quality. So Caricante, together with some of the grapes of Italy, such as Verdicchio, Fiano, and a couple others, considered to be some of the best white grapes of Italy, I'm saying noble grape, right? Interestingly enough, the name Caricante comes from the Italian word caricare, or load up. May load up in the sense that the grapes were loaded up on donkeys, on baskets, and eventually would be transferred to the cellars and the winery for pressing and vinification and whatnot. So it tells you about the fact that the grape is highly productive, but at the same time, because you're in extreme condition, is able to still convey incredible quality. It is a grape that thrives in these extreme conditions and environments, likes high altitudes. As a matter of fact, all the plantings of Caricante basically happen between 800 and 1,000, sometimes 1,100 meters of elevation. So which is really where the Nerellos wouldn't be able to provide the ultimate quality of the wine. When it comes to the actual grape itself, it definitely, a grape, you can tell by the bunch, it's got this very nice, very plumpy, medium large bunch, very long, with thick skin, and lots of this so-called pruina, which is basically the bloom, is a protein you see on the berries itself, this kind of like white coating. As I mentioned, loves these extreme conditions. And when you think about the aromatic bouquet, if you will, of the wines, is the kind of wines that has a lot of lemon quality, green apple quality, definitely a lot of botanical herbs. So it's not an intensely aromatic grape by any means, but it's a very precise when it comes to the specific aromatics, and also is the kind of wine that always has this kind of lemony mineral and also saline quality. You got to figure most of the plantings of Caricante are located on the eastern side, and the eastern side of the Etna, where the vineyards are located, is the closest to the ocean. So it does to the ocean or the Mediterranean Sea. So it does get the effect of this salinity and almost like salty, savory quality that comes from that specific condition. And lastly, in Sicily, Caricante is referred to as Montagnuolo. Montagnuolo means like the person, or in this case, the grape from the mountain, because really planted at extreme high elevation, typically almost be like the last harvested, because again, up here, everything is manually done. So there's not a lot of, there's no mechanization actually whatsoever. So obviously the highest part would be always the last to be harvested. So important to have grapes that can sustain long ripening and have high built-in acidity, right? Then when it comes to The red grapes, there's two, obviously Nerello Mascalese, most importantly, and secondly, there also plays, a fairly relevant role. It's called the Nerello Cappuccio. Nerello Mascalese, it's actually a grape whose name originated from the town of Mascali. So Mascali is a small village or town located almost at the base of Etna, nearby Catania. And supposedly this is where the grape was first selected. That's why Nerello Mascalese refers to the little black grape from Mascali. As a matter of fact, interestingly enough, this grape is considered to be a beach bum by Salvo Foti. Salvo Foti is the owner, winemaker from I Vineyards, a very important historical estate on Etna, and probably the person that knows most about the grapes, most knowledgeable anyway, about the grapes and wines of Etna. And beach bum because it's a grape that, yes, still plenty on fairly high elevation, but enjoys the sun, enjoys the vicinity of the sea, and really thrives in this beautiful environment. When you look at the actual bunch of Nerello Mascalese here, we have this medium to small berries. They have little, almost like oval shape, and they have this almost like a light blue coloration to it. Nerello Mascalese, thanks to DNA research, we know that it's actually a crossing, or was born out of the natural crossing between Sangiovese and Mantonico Bianco. So practically, it's a grape that was born and is related to both Sangiovese and Mantonico Bianco, but is also a sibling of Caricante. So it's very interesting today to find out all this stuff thanks to DNA research. When it comes to the actual characteristics of the grape itself, Nerello Mascalese has high tannins and low anthocyanins. So it's not going to have a lot of skin pigmentation. It's never going to give you very darkly colored wines. As a matter of fact, that is the reason why Nerello Cappuccio comes into play as a supportive grape that actually brings in the color, especially in more challenging vintages, or sometimes in support of grapes that come from areas where not as sunny exposed, and you're not going to get the same amount of coloration. Also, one of the characteristics of Nerello Mascalese is that a high concentration of terpenes, and specifically these terpenes of Nerello Mascalese are bound, which means that eventually they're going to release the aromatic profile, or the intenser aromatic profile over time. And specifically, one of the main molecules contained in the bouquet of Nerello Mascalese is geraniol, and obviously geraniol gives this beautiful floral aromas, which are typical. Also, there's red fruit, and then one of the other aromatic characteristics always commonly associated with Nerello Mascalese are this musky, tobacco, a slightly earthy, savory type of quality, which is a very, very pleasant, very intriguing. Sometimes, as people mention or say that Nerello Mascalese reminds them also of Pinot Noir to a certain degree. Overall, the grape, it's a late ripener, which obviously makes total sense in a place where you have to go longer, you're able to ripen the grapes because conditions are fairly extreme. Although based on, the wines are going to be changing quite a bit based on the weather, elevation, and the specific vintage of the harvest. It's also a very vigorous and abundant producer. So the vine, although they're older vines, they're always going to give you quite a bit of fruit, although it is irregular. So from vintage to vintage, things can change quite a bit. And as it shows from the various pictures, the main, or really for the most part the only, but I want to say the main trellising system is the ancient alberello etneo, which is basically a unique form of alberello that adapted to the Etna. And also these, as you can see, one picture on the bottom shows you the fact that in the winter time, these areas are totally covered by snow, so conditions are very extreme. And also on the picture in the top left corner shows you the so-called cumuli, or little pyramids, because yes, Etna tends to be an area where there's a decent amount of rain, but in some areas actually of Etna, there's not a lot of rain. So what they do, they actually have to form these little pyramids, or so-called cumuli, so that when it rains, eventually the water, it's kind of driven towards the vine, so that the vine can, have the necessary amount of water to eventually survive and sustain the production for the next harvest, right? And lastly, I want to say about Nerello Mascalese is that, as I mentioned, for the Caricante, the eastern part of the Etna is the most historical high quality overall, versus when it comes to Nerello Mascalese, the northern sector of Etna is the one that is historically most important, where the most important plantings are located, the oldest vine, pre-phylloxera are located. And as a matter of fact, this is also where we find most of the contrade, and specifically contrade where Nerello Mascalese based wines are produced. Okay, hopefully it was clear as an overview of these two major grapes. And now I'm just going to mention about also the Nerello Cappuccio, because it is a key grape. It's a grape of great interest, and seems like more and more producers are going to want to start producing also some wines, maybe 100% Nerello Mascalese. Technically today, it's not legal to make, obviously it's not legal to make an Etna DOC with 100% Nerello Mascalese, because it can only be blended up to 20%. But at the same time, there's producers that maybe have very old vines in Nerello Mascalese. They want to make 100% Nerello Mascalese. They're not going to call it Etna DOC. They're just going to call it Terre Siciliane or Sicilia DOC, or one of those appellations that allow you to do that, if you will. Now, Nerello Cappuccio, it's the name itself. Again, Nerello, same idea as the Mascalese, where little, black grape. Cappuccio, because I have a picture of the bunch here, but the bunch is kind of almost like this hat type of shape. It's a bigger bunch. And again, Cappuccio from cappello in Italian, or cap. And for a long time was actually confused with Carignano, because in the southern sector of Etna, actually, there's a lot of plantings of Carignano. Carignano, it's another one of those, beach bums, or maybe one of those grapes that thrive throughout the Mediterranean. As you know, a lot in Sardinia, a lot in other parts of the, Mediterranean countries. And a lot of it is found here as well. And before any of the real genetic studies or ampelography was developed to where it is today, people thought that basically the vineyards of Carignano were actually Nerello Cappuccio. But today, although some are still interplanted, we know that they're not the same grapes, although they do share some of the same ampelographic similarities, right? Overall, anyway, Nerello Cappuccio is a medium to large bunch, and the berries tend to be rounder versus they're oval, like in Nerello Mascalese, and they have this very dark blue coloration. Opposite in the Mascalese, the tannins are low, and there's a higher pigmentation of the skin, so release a slightly darker color. Again, the wines are not going to be purple or super dark, but because of the higher concentration of pigments, that allows to be a perfect blending partner for the Nerello Mascalese. What it does, though, also tones down the wines, so it gives a little bit more an element of roundness, a little bit more an element of fruit concentration. And also a little bit more suppleness, if you will, in some cases. Although many producers decide to work exclusively with Nerello Mascalese, but Nerello Cappuccio is the quintessential partner for these wines. And as far as flavors and aromas, definitely tends to release a little bit more this kind of a spicy quality, like clove, vanilla, also ripe fruit notes, most importantly a dark cherry. So these are kind of like the elements that are eventually combined together with Nerello Mascalese for the production of wines. It is also a grape that buds early, so it's going to have a long ripening season because of the early budding. One of the challenging sometimes for Cappuccio specifically are spring frosts, again, because it does bud early. And lastly, where we see most planting of Nerello Cappuccio is the southern sector. So kind of like it's a breakdown where Nerello Mascalese is in the north, Caricante in the east, and Nerello Cappuccio is in the south, although these are gross generalizations, because you also have to figure that as much as I can say that the best, and this is not me, but obviously people who know a lot more than me say that the best, most historical, traditional, highest quality Caricante grapes come from the east. Today, if a producer has vineyards in the north, and that's where their estate is, that's where they're going to plant also some vines of Caricante to make their Etna Bianco. They're not necessarily going to acquire grapes from another part, or necessarily own vineyards in another part. So it's important to also understand that, because again, I'm also generalizing when I mention that. And then a little bit more specifically, I created, I have another map that basically shows you the three sectors and what is some of the more differences, or some of the differences, if you will, between the wines in the north, the wines in the east, and the wines of the south. Here I only obviously put few labels, a mix of things. Obviously there's so many other great producers that should have been here, but otherwise I would have need to spend a day just to put all the labels here. But anyway, a few of the examples, obviously very historical Graci, Passo Pisciaro, but also Tornatore, as much as Terre Nere. At the same time, it shows you also, like, for example, Il Cantante is a property owned by Mike Hacknell of the Simply Red, that fell in love with the area, decided to produce wines. And also I wanted to show through some of these labels other important historical families, might as well be of Sicily, but also not necessarily Sicily, like in the case of Angelo Gaia from Piemonte. They decided to actually come to Etna and invest because they realized the incredible potential and the great quality of the wines, and specifically in the Idda, or also Donna Fugata, which is also an establishment in Sicily, but they migrated here from the western part of the island. And lastly, also Duca di Salaparuta, another historical producer that bought a small piece of land in the northern part of Etna where the Alcantara Valley is located. So it really shows the fact that today Etna is not just a localized affair, but rather it's an international affair where people from all over Italy and all over the world are investing. And as a matter of fact, it proves the fact that the wines are fantastic. Okay, and this is the map that practically tells you, again, the idea where the Etna is located. The northern sector, most of the vineyards are between, basically between 500 and 800 meters, right? So that's kind of like the average where vineyards are located. This is also the area, as I mentioned, most of the contrade are located, because again we have also this is where there is the moderate harvest time, and also there is the fact that these are like the very historical pre-phylloxera vines. Some of the major contrade here are definitely Provitello, Solecchiata, Chiappe Mancine, Guardiola, and most importantly Santo Spirito. As a matter of fact, I have here an example of Santo Spirito. It's not about the producer, mostly just to show you, as you probably have seen, is Contrada Santo Spirito di Passo Pisciaro. And the wines from this area tend to be quite recognized as far as by people, in the sense that the wines tend to have a little bit more juiciness, a little bit more suppleness, a little bit more immediacy of drinking time as a window. So that's why people are more falling in love, and that's why there's a lot of articles specifically about this area and these contrade. And I also listed some of the top producers that have estates and grow vines in the specific area, such as Graci, Passo Pisciaro, Cornelissen, and definitely Terre Nere altogether. The eastern sector, obviously here the conditions are a little different. The slopes tend to be steeper because here we're closer to the coastline, so things are a little bit more compact. So it just kind of like goes up very vertically, if you will. And some of the main contrade are Piano dell'Acqua, Fleri. Then again, in the township of Milo, which is right here in the middle, is one of the 20 towns of contrade, 20 towns, sorry, of the Etna DOC. There is an area dedicated to the Etna Bianco Superiore. So practically, this is the one and only area where Etna Bianco can become superiore because of the condition of the environment, because the fact is the rainiest area, some of the highest elevation vineyards, and historically, Caricante has always been planted here. And within Milo, obviously there are a few contrade, but the most important is called Caselle, which is the one recognized to be the Grand Cru, where the wines reach incredible levels of minerality, super like firm, high acidity. So these wines actually generally, they need at least 3, 4, 5 years before being opened. So because the alcohol, sorry, not the alcohol, but the acidity is so piercing, so malolactic fermentation becomes also relevant for the wines, because otherwise they would be almost like undrinkable to a certain degree, right? Overall, also for the red wines, because obviously this area outside of Milo, there's quite a bit of production of red wines. The wine, this is the area where there's earlier ripening. There's the wines tend to be, refined, juicy, and they have a bit more of an early appeal, so maybe not so age-worthy. And lastly, we are in the southern southern sector. And again, take this as a grain of salt, because there is to say that every exposure, every elevation, everything is different from one vineyard to another. So I have to a little bit generalize here, because we're not tasting wines. And we're not talking about specific producer or specific labels. But anyhow, the southern sectors is where there's a lot of vineyards, but not producers. So historically, this is an area where they were like more like a negociant to a certain degree. So practically they would grow grapes and grow grapes and eventually sell them. So not a lot of houses here, although the main contrade here are Cavaliere, Mallorca, Stella, and also, as I mentioned, some of the vineyards here, they're also very high, as the fact that the Etna continues to flow and continues to erupt, and actually this is the part of the crater that keeps on growing. And in this area specifically, there are a lot of vineyards on old vines of Nerello Cappuccio. Lastly, this is a late ripening area. Interestingly enough, although this is the southern part of Etna, is the area where the vines ripens the latest, because also is the elevation. So that's why it's important to understand in Etna, differently than other territories of Italy, is not just about north vineyards versus south vineyards or east vineyards, but is also where the elevation of the vineyards is located. And also if it's north, but is south exposure, or north exposure, or and vice versa with the south. So there's different, really an incredible versatility, incredible amount of elements that come into play when it comes to Etna wines to really define and shape where the wines are going to be, which obviously are very, very different from one another. And last but not least, I want to mention about the Parliamento, because Parliamento is this almost like obviously archaic, but traditional and historical system that was created in the area for the pressing on the wine, and then practically a gravity flow where the juice will flow into this massive like vats or cement tanks. Today, today, but anyway, for years, the Parliamento is no longer allowed because of hygiene reasons. Although, many of these Parliamentos, because of these beautiful, beautiful structures, they've been refurbished to become restaurants. They've been refurbished to become other things that are part of the winery, but not necessarily to make wine. Some producers are making an effort within the within the regulations of the EU to be able to eventually refurbish the Parliamento to become an active part of the vinification process of the grapes. Although it's a lot of work, because obviously this is a massive structure made out of cement, but hopefully we're going that direction. Some producers can do it, and they're really definitely beautiful to visit, at least to understand the history and the old history of this territory. And then lastly, I put just a picture. Obviously, this is one of the many pictures that we see, and we've seen many recently, specifically about the beautiful eruptions, very picturesque eruptions of the Etna that continues to impress globally, and continues to create this very unique environment where the vines produce some of the best wines in the world, right? So I hope I was able to cover as much as possible without stopping for one quick second. And I hope it was interesting to kind of understand a little bit Etna large.
Take a breath. Oh my God, that was amazing. It is quite a gorgeous picture that you have there, although it looks a little bit ominous, but it's that was an amazing presentation. You didn't stop for 1 second. And very rich. We got a lot of information there, and I think we have some good questions as well. So let's get started.
Can I stop sharing? Or
yeah, if you'd like, you can stop sharing it. Take one last gorgeous look at that picture, and then
I can leave it. Doesn't matter. It's fine.
It adds drama to the whole thing. Okay. Rob asks why the Etna DOC does not include land in the western part of the mountain.
Because that's in the last few centuries, I want to say, that's the area where there's more like flows of lava, which obviously when there is a newer lava flows, if you will, that doesn't allow really the vine, not only because the lava, you don't want to be very close to it, but also because eventually, that has to erode and, kind of crumble into the soil and form the soils that are allowed for planting of vines. But most importantly is because the lava flows are flowing on that end, and you can't really, risk that.
Okay, that's a good question, Rob. Rich asks, as I understand, 95% of minerals for the vines comes from clay-sized soil. Why is lava good for the vine?
Well, because the lava, it's practically minerals. They're contained inside the earth, crust and the mantle, right? And they're expelled by obviously lava flows and explosions. And all these minerals eventually, after the explosion, after the erosion, after, sometimes thousands and hundreds of years, they eventually, create soils that are incredibly mineral rich, which they tend to become loam, sand, obviously there's a clay element, there's an underground limestone matter, because again, at one point it was underneath the ocean. So it's not just you're right, but it's not just one thing that ultimately creates this mineral-rich soils. There's a variety of things, and obviously lava is exactly that. It's all, rocks that has been transformed into, liquid form, and then eventually gets back into a solid form.
Okay. So thanks for that question, Rich. Rich has there's another question. What is the purpose of the cumuli, or the little pyramids that you showed in the slide there, the photographs of the little pyramids?
That was, as I mentioned, that was to collect water, because there are certain parts of Etna, say, for example, on the western part, on the eastern part, where the white grapes are mostly planted, you get up to 1,700 millimeters of water per year, right? In other parts, obviously, it's a lot less than that. So whatever water comes down from rains, they have to try to accumulate the most. And so that's why traditionally growers, they understood the necessity of creating this cumuli, or the little pyramid, so when it rains, eventually the water goes towards the central part and collects right where the vines of the roots of the vines are located, instead of getting dispersed in an area where there's no vines, or would be eventually just evaporate. So that way it gets basically diverted towards the plants and the roots.
Okay, gather the water that way. Okay. Kim has a question. Are the current DOC wines from existing vineyards still of very old ungrafted vines, or from newer plantings, properly grafted, if any, to meet the generally strict DOC requirements?
Yeah, obviously the DOC doesn't necessarily require the vines to be pre-phylloxera or ungrafted vines. There are sections of Etna, especially the oldest sections, where viticulture and winemaking has been developed for a very long time, where there is, as I mentioned, in the north, specifically for Nerello Mascarese, some Nerello Cappuccio in the south, and obviously some of the Caricante to the east. But obviously, because the area has been growing, although it's decreased a lot from what it used to be in the 1800s to what it is today, but in the last 20 years, especially because the high demand that there's been a lot more plantings. Obviously, there's also younger vines. Not all it's old vines or ungrafted. So you can have a mix of both, but the most important thing beyond the age of the vines is the fact that the vines are all alberello, which is this, also unique trellising system, which is typical of the area.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that question, Kim. Luke asks, is the southern sector late ripening mostly due to the planting altitude?
Yeah, one is for sure is the altitude that plays a major role there, because when you have such high altitude, obviously conditions are going to be overall cooler, although there's quite a bit of sun because it's still Sicily. There's also a series of clouds that always circulate around the crater. So for that reason, anyhow, for a variety of reasons, yes, that's because the elevation, that's always the late harvested area. And for that reason, it takes longer. Sometimes you're going all the way into like a beginning, if not mid of November. So harvest can be very, very late on, and also depend, obviously elevation and whatnot.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that question, Luke. Paul has a question. How many vineyards on Etna have ever been destroyed by lava flow?
Well, it is, although, again, most of the lava flows have been happening towards the west, but there are occurrences where obviously there's no like a guardrail, if you will, anything like that kind of directs the lava in a certain direction. There have been instances where you see some images, if you go online, vineyards totally covered, but also the homes, some of the small, not so much homes, but like basically places where farmers would store all their equipment and things they use to tend to the vineyards. They're totally covered by lava. So it is an occurrence, especially when you're in the higher part, closer to the mouth of the crater. Although it's not so common, unfortunately, it doesn't really kill people, if you will, create a lot of victims, because again, the lava flows here, the way the volcano acts, they're very slow lava flows. It's not one of those super speedy or lots of pyroclastic with mega explosions. So.
Okay, great. Thanks for that question, Paul. Karen asks, is it safe to assume that volcanic soil is very water permeable?
It is. It depends also what kind of volcanic soil. Because obviously, when you say volcanic soil, it means a lot of different things. It can be pumice, it can be obviously lava, it can be tuff, it can be lapilli. So obviously, as it erodes, eventually transforms into something different altogether. But altogether, yes, the idea is that, but obviously it depends, on a variety of factors too. Okay. And I'm sorry if I don't answer specifically the question, but again, it's not just one thing.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Karen. And finally, we have a question from Roseanne, who says, can you suggest guidelines on how long to age an Etna Rosso to allow development of the aromas and flavors? You explained develop with age.
Yeah, especially Marello Mascalese, which is the based red wines, which are the ones that have this bound terpenes, which obviously will open to a certain degree and develop the aromas over time. I would say, especially today, where although the history of winemaking is long on here, there's not a lot of history when it comes to old bottlings, other than in very few specific instances. I would say a good example of an Etna Rosso, not even Reserva, just the Etna Rosso, I would say like probably 8-9 years from harvest, it's when things are really going to start happening. And also, obviously, it depends upon where vineyards are located, if it's a blend or not, and all these other factors. But I would say that's a good window of time to really start getting Etna aromas and bouquet in full bloom. When it comes to whites, obviously the whites can age very well upwards to 10 years, sometimes even longer than that. But usually, as I mentioned earlier, probably not before 3, 4, 5 years, just because the acidity, it can be so like lemony tart, which can be off-putting in some cases, unless you're prepared for that and you love that aspect of the wine.
Okay, so thanks for that question, Roseanne. Well, thank you so much, Ciro. This was a fascinating look at, if you have a second, take a look at the chat box. I'll also send you a copy of it, but you've got really nice comments and some people saying some nice things to you in Italian and English and all kinds of languages. It's true that we do have a Wine Scholar Guild trip going to Sicily this year, and with Karen O'Keefe, so they've got a nice itinerary planned just a lovely trip. So and I was just asking, are those sheep that are looking at the eruption in the field there in the picture?
Yes, they're grazing. Because you got to figure on Etna, because of although here you're not specifically on Etna where this picture is, the Etna is in distance, but even if it wasn't the Etna, you have this almost like kaleidoscope of things where you have some areas have a very green, lush vegetation. Some parts obviously are very black because of the lava, and some parts are fully covered by flowers, also because it tells you about the fertility of the soils. And that's why some of the best might as well be tomatoes or other agricultural products besides grapes come from this territory, just like it happens on the Vesuvius, because again, the rich soils provide for fantastic flavor into the agricultural product, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny because they don't seem very disturbed by the eruption going on. No. One of them sort of sleeping, the other one's
it's
kind
just
of
like people. That's why they keep building homes even close by, say like 300-400 meters. Obviously, it's not 1,100 meters, but because people here, just like people in Campania where I'm from, they live their entire life and multiple generations with the vicinity in the backyard of a volcano. So take it for what it is. Obviously, there's risks involved, but at the same time, there is also it's life.
Yeah, it's a part of life. It's just that's the way it is.
Yes.
Okay, well, grazie, Ciro. That was so great. I think that made everyone want to go have a glass of Etna wine, whether it's a white or red, or, you know, at least we learned a lot, maybe eventually travel to the region as well. So thank you so much. Can't wait to have you back. So we'll talk about that. I'll send you the chat box and the link that we talked about before. And thank you everyone for joining us. The recording, if you want to watch it again, will be up in the next 24 hours. Remind you that the handout is also up in the just underneath the announcement to the webinar. Grazie. Have a nice day, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone tomorrow, and we'll see you soon, Ciro, for another presentation.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, obviously, the Wine Scholar Guild for having me, and thank you all for being here today. Keep enjoying Etna, keep enjoying a lot of every different things. Have a wonderful day.
Okay, thank you. Grazie.
Ciao.
Bye-bye. Ciao.
Ciao.